Welcome, detectives. Thank you for joining us for this evening of murder and mystery. Let us wait just a few more moments for any latecomers to the event. Listen for the chime that will sound when it is time for us to begin. Meanwhile, I'd love to know where you detectives are tuning in from. If you want to share, add your towns, cities, or countries to the comments section. We're solving this mystery together, so I encourage you to post your thoughts about the suspects and evidence as the case progresses. You might also want to spend this time getting prepared. Are you sitting comfortably? Do you have your thinking caps at the ready? You might want a pen and paper to hand for writing notes. It's time for us to begin. We have 4 suspects waiting for us to start. My name is Detective Schofield, and I've been called in from out of town to assist with this case. You might already be familiar with Vera Stanhope. She's a bit of a local legend around here. She's been working hard this evening, pulling all the evidence together. You should have been emailed the scene of crime report already. If not, then I'll pop the evidence on the screen for you to see a bit later. I should probably set the scene before we head inside, let you know what you're in for tonight. For this evening, you are not in your homes, but rather an old country house on a long snowy night in Northumberland. You are at Brockburn House, home of the Stanhope family. Brockburn House is, to put it lightly, run down and in grave need of repair. Yet the family have been working hard to keep the house a central part of the community. I hear the parties held here are legendary, with tonight being no exception. I've never attended personally, but I've heard the stories of all the glitz and glamour. It's a night to die for. Well, maybe not my best choice of words, given the circumstances. Earlier this evening, the Stanhope family and their guests were gathered to celebrate the Winter Solstice at the house. Full of artists and musicians, it is a favourite tradition of the village now. Then the party was interrupted. A body was found out in the snow. Harriet Stanhope had been stabbed to death outside the kitchen door of her own home. Such a tragedy. That's why our work here is so important. We need to seek justice for Harriet. Unfortunately, the blizzard outside covered much of the evidence we'd usually hope to find, making this a particularly tough case to crack. I'm so grateful that you detectives have offered to look at the case, because in the tradition of the Golden Age detective novel, it is clear that only the people in the house could have committed the murder. We already have our 4 suspects, and I need you to help me get 4 witness statements from them. I think if we ask the right questions, then one of them might just slip up, give us the clues we need. Listen to their stories and be careful. Remember, one of them is a killer. Let's start. I'll lead on the interview, but I'll need you to make notes and pick up on anything unusual that is said. First up is Dorothy. She's the housekeeper here.
Midwinter at Brockburn has always been special. I visited often when I was a teenager, and it was my favourite time of year. For a city girl, the log fires, the huge tree cut from the forest, and the rather glamorous parties seemed to belong to a different age. Juliet was my best friend at school. When she came to stay with me in Newcastle, we went to the theatre or the cinema to see some art house movie. My mother was an academic who thought all entertainment should be improving. When I was at her home, there were long walks in the hills. Juliet always worried that I'd be bored, but I thought I got the better deal. We were left pretty much to ourselves, and I loved that freedom and all the space. As we got older, we were invited downstairs for the adult dinners, and we'd get all dressed up, dreaming perhaps of some Prince Charming to sweep us off our feet. In the event, most of the guests were old enough to be our grandfathers, but still we dreamed. My mother was invited once or twice, but she never really fitted in, and she soon made excuses to stay away. There was always a party to celebrate the solstice, the darkest evening of the year, and some of the younger people from the village were there for that. Tenant farmers and their families, local artists and musicians. There was always music. Now, I'm back at Brockburn, not as a guest, but as a member of staff. After school, Juliet came straight home to help her parents manage the estate. I went on to Cambridge to read law and ended up as a barrister in a chambers in London. But neither the work nor the city suited me, and I had a sort of breakdown. By then, Juliet was married, and she and her husband were pretty much running the big house, with the help or interference of her mother, Harriet. Crispin, her father, is an elderly man now, but he's still got an eye for the women, especially the younger women. He tried to get friendly with me once, when I was still a student, and I was almost seduced by his charm and flattery. He was a good-looking man, even in middle age. Juliet warned me off, though. He and Mummy haven't got on for years, but he'd never leave her. He'd just be one of a string of his conquests, she said. And when I came back to Brockburn to work, I'm not even sure he recognised me until Juliet reminded him who I was. There was something about the way he looked at me that made me wonder if he was regretting his earlier behaviour. He seemed almost apologetic. The grand house was suffering from years of neglect. I had a sense of it, creaking and groaning, in need of care and restoration. Mark, Jules's husband, comes from a theatrical background and has this idea of turning it into a sort of Glyndebourne of the North, with a performance space inside as well as out, rehearsal rooms and weekend retreats for writers. He's looking for funding, but in this financial climate it's not easy. When she heard I'd been ill and that I needed a job, Juliet asked if I'd like to work for them as a live-in housekeeper. She was embarrassed to ask, but I could tell she was desperate and really wasn't about creating a post to do me a favour. I love it. I've always enjoyed cooking and bringing order out of chaos. It's just as well with all that goes on here. They all act as if there's still a regiment of servants, and instead, there's only me. Juliet and Mark planned a very special party for this year's Midwinter's Eve. There'd be a few of the usual guests from the village, but they had also invited a group of Mark's wealthier arty and business friends. The idea was that we'd give them an old-fashioned country house party, and they'd want to buy into the place and his scheme. Mark planned to ask them to pledge lots of cash that he could match fund from other sources. So, not only was there the meal to prepare, but those guests were staying the night with us. It meant a lot of work, but I so wanted it to be special. In the end, I wasn't sure if the party would actually take place because it started to snow. Just a flurry at first, and then a blizzard. Huge flakes that stuck to the freezing ground. A few couples cancelled, but most turned up early, before I was really ready for them. We provided tea in the lounge, and the fires were all lit, and there was that reflected light that you only get when everything outside is white. I spent most of the evening in the kitchen, Juliet had asked me to eat with them, but I was far too busy, and anyway, Harriet would never have approved. She treats me like I'm a kitchen maid, despite my very good degree, and the fact that she's known me since I was a schoolgirl. But perhaps it's not a good idea to speak like that about Harriet. Not now that she's dead. It could be taken the wrong way. I found her body. There was a lull after I'd taken in the pudding for our guests, and I could take a moment to catch my breath. The snow had stopped, and looking through the kitchen window, I saw the sliver of a moon. Everything was freezing and very still. Brockburn is close to the Dark Skies Reserve in Kielder Forest, and I wanted to be outside for a moment to look up at the stars. There are no street lights for miles, no houses either. So I pulled on my wellies and a jacket and went out through the back door. And there was Harriet, in a heap, not very far from the outhouse where we keep coal and logs, not far from the bins. She was still in her party clothes, a long dress in a soft black wool, and a shawl sparkled with silver. On her feet, little silver shoes. My first thought was that the cold would have killed her, lying there icy with no coat or boots, if it weren't for the knife stuck in her chest and the blood which had turned the snow red all around her. I don't know how she could have got there. I was in and out of the kitchen all evening, and I didn't see anyone else go through. Even if someone had lured her outside without my noticing, surely she would have dressed properly for the weather. There were no footprints in the snow, so she must have been put there before the blizzard stopped. It was all very mysterious. I didn't scream. I'm not the screaming type. I phoned Harriet Stanhope, who lives in a cottage in the hills not far from Brockburn. I knew from Juliet that she's a sort of relative of the family, and that she's a detective. I don't know if you'll get through, I said. It stopped snowing, but it's freezing. She told me her Land Rover could cope with more severe weather than this. Just keep the buggers away from the scene, she said. And that's what I did. I went into the dining room and explained that Harriet was dead, and they all had to stay where they were until the police arrived. I stood at the door like some sort of security guard. Mark demanded to be let through. Juliet was weeping and Crispin was blustering. But I stood my ground until I heard the Land Rover growling to a stop and Vera made her entrance.
Very insightful. It was helpful to us that Dorothy was so proactive in calling Vera up to the house. Smart girl. Goodness knows what this case would have looked like without her making that call. Next, we'll be talking to Mark, Juliet's husband. He's one of those creative types.
When I married Juliet, I knew I'd have to take on the house too, and her bonkers parents. The deal came as a package, and Jules would never live anywhere else. I've always been a city boy. My background is in the arts, a degree in theatre and performance at Northumbria Uni, specialising in script writing and direction. When Juliet and I hooked up, I was creative director for a theatre in Newcastle, and I still work for them part-time as a consultant. At first, I was rather seduced by the whole country-living lord of the manor thing. It was like wandering into a scene from Brideshead Revisited with all the hunting and shooting and weekend house parties. It didn't take long to realise it was all show, and that the house was actually crumbling around our ears. The family might own lots of land, but it has very little ready cash. So I came up with this idea to turn Brockburn into a creative centre, with performance spaces and a theatre, where writers and performers can inspire each other. We'd have audiences flocking to the place thanks to its stunning background, and of course we'd have a bar selling locally brewed beer and a cafe with homemade cakes. Maybe allow glamping in the grounds, put up a teepee or two and a cluster of shepherd's huts. Once it was up and running, the place would be a gold mine. Of course, Harriet and Crispin resisted at first. Harriet especially. Couldn't bear the idea of her home being overrun by arty plebs from the town. She married into the place, so I couldn't quite understand her obsession with tradition. She wasn't stupid. She must have seen that the plumbing hardly functions, that the place is freezing even in the summer. This is Northumberland. It's become a struggle, even to settle the bills in the village shops. Crispin, however, quite liked the idea of young actresses wandering through the grounds. He's always been a lechy goat, and I had enough dirt on him to persuade him to my point of view. Naturally, I wouldn't stoop to blackmail, but I did remind him of an affair he had quite a long time ago with a woman of my acquaintance. Harriet must have known about his flings. There were enough of them. But this lover had kept a letter from him. It was rather moving, actually. I think he might have even loved her, but not as much as he loved Brockburn. And besides, Crispin would have hated any notion of scandal. I had no reason at all to kill Harriet. Any resistance to my development scheme for the house would have been ridiculous once Crispin was on board. The woman might have acted as if she was in charge, but she knew that, in the end, any decision would be his. The house is his inheritance, and the upper classes set great store on breeding, don't they? The bloodline is everything. I can't even remember when I last saw Harriet this evening. We pushed the boat out for our special dinner guests. Anything to make them agree to contribute to our development plan. A great deal of wine was consumed throughout the evening, and really my plan was working like a dream. The pledges of cash were flying in. I just hope this dreadful murder doesn't make them change their mind. If anything, perhaps the publicity will work to our advantage. I can see the headlines in the Nationals. A real country house murder mystery. Or how did they describe all those Golden Age detective stories? I know, snobbery with violence. At least that would put Brockburn on the map. Harriet was still there for the dessert and the cheese. But I don't think she came with us when Dorothy brought coffee into the drawing room afterwards. I have an idea that Jules went to look for her at one point, to check that she was okay. Harriet was a bully, and Juliet was always terrified of upsetting her, always running after her. I suspect that Harriet would have respected her more if she'd been a little less solicitous. Crispin was in and out all evening. I'm not sure why he kept disappearing. Perhaps he was phoning one of his young lovers. I know I shouldn't say this, but I rather admire his style. I hope I'm as lively when I'm his age. Yes, I did go outside at one point, just to clear my head. I'd got caught up in the general festivities and needed a moment on my own. But I went out through the main door, from the entrance hall, not through the kitchen. That's very much Dorothy's domain, and I didn't want to disturb her. She doesn't welcome interference. She might be Juliet's old school friend, but there's something surly about her manner, and I'm not sure that she'll fit into the new, more relaxed regime of the arts centre. I didn't go very far. I just stopped under the portico on top of the impressive stone steps. It was still snowing then, though the wind had dropped a little, and there was the glimmer of a moon. The grounds looked so beautiful that I thought how lucky I was to be part of the place. Despite the aggravation and the effort, I was proud to be bringing the old house back to life. Harriet brought something special to Brockburn too, a timeless grandeur and a sophistication. In a strange way, I'll miss her too.
Interesting. So there was a lot of tension between Mark and Juliet's parents. That's probably worth noting. Now let's see what Juliet has to say.
I can't actually believe that Mummy's dead. She's always been a force of nature, so strong, so determined. Mark said I shouldn't let her bully me, but I don't think he ever felt the strength of her personality. She never really took to Mark. She would have preferred someone who understood the obligations and traditions attached to a house like Brockburn. And perhaps the bravest thing I did was to marry him. In the end, she didn't consider him worth fighting with. She tended simply to ignore him. Deep down, I think she realised his plans were the only way to keep the house in the family. The alternative would have been to sell up and lose the place altogether. She would have hated that. The place defined her. Dorothy did most of the work for the evening's grand dinner party. Mummy dismissed her as a glorified skivvy. but she is a brilliant cook and wonderfully organised. I was always mortified at the way my mother spoke to a woman who was far more educated than any of us and who kept the whole show on the road. It was so embarrassing. Dorothy and I have been friends since we were 11, and I can't imagine managing all of this without her. I got into a panic when people turned up early and spent the afternoon trying to make them comfortable. The rooms upstairs are a bit chilly if you're not used to them, and so once people had changed for dinner, they all appeared downstairs before I was quite expecting them. Dorothy was a star as always, and turned out with mulled wine and homemade nibbles, though that wasn't part of the original plan. At about 6:30, I went up to ask Mummy to join us. After all, she was technically the hostess, and she was so much better at entertaining than me. She brought a touch of sparkle, of magic, wherever she went. The radiator in her room always seemed miraculously to work, so I suspect she was hiding away in there in the warm. In the end, I didn't even knock at her door, because I could hear her shouting at someone. At first, I thought she might be on the phone, but there was a mumbled reply, so someone else must have been there. I really didn't want to interrupt in case she and Daddy were having one of their mega rows. She appeared downstairs, looking amazingly glamorous and perfectly calm and collected, just before we were all about to move into the dining room. Daddy arrived at about the same time. I don't know where he'd been earlier in the evening. I have no evidence that he was the person with Mummy when I went to find her. But who else could it have been? Mark would certainly not have gone voluntarily into what he called the lion's den. Mummy and Daddy have had separate rooms for as long as I can remember. When I was younger, I thought that was rather grand, that the arrangement was similar to that of the royal family. Now I realise it was just because they couldn't stand each other. Father hid it well. He's a perfect gentleman. In public, charming, making everyone in the room feel very special. But I thought he seemed flustered, a little distracted when he finally appeared. He took my mother's arm and led everyone into dinner. We ate in the formal dining room and everything seemed perfect. There was a huge log fire, which had been roaring all day and had made the room deliciously warm. We have no shortage of firewood living on the edge of the forest. The silver gleamed and the glasses reflected the light from the candles. Dorothy had employed a couple of teenagers from the village to help her serve. The food was as wonderful as I knew it would be. When the meal was over, the group started to break up. Dorothy popped her head in to say she'd be serving coffee in the drawing room. I knew that was because she wanted to clear the table. The girls who'd been helping her had walked back to the village after the main course to get home before the next flurry of snow. I don't think I saw Mother after that. The whole evening became a bit of a muddle. We'd had lots of wine with dinner, and there was a tray with brandy and whiskey in the drawing room, so most people were just a little bit tipsy. Free booze seems irresistible, it seems, even if you're stinking rich. I did escape on a couple of occasions. Since I've been a girl, I've had this dreadful social anxiety, and the whole evening had been an ordeal. Mark says I'll have to get over that when the house is open every night to different audiences and performances. I went up to our room for 10 minutes or so to redo my makeup. Our room is what Mark calls effing Baltic, and some time in there certainly sobered me up. At one point, I looked out of the window. We're at the front of the house, and the gardens looked magical. Mark had strung fairy lights on the huge cedar near the main drive. I thought I saw someone walking around the side of the house towards the kitchen door, but I just caught a shape from the side of my eye, and when I looked properly, it had disappeared. There was a line of fresh footprints, though it started to snow heavily again, and soon they disappeared too. I wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Mummy always said I was given to fancies. But if the footprints really were there, the killer must have gone out through the front door and not via the kitchen, and that doesn't make any sense at all. I'd not long returned to the drawing room when Dorothy arrived. She was carrying a fresh pot of coffee, which she set on the sideboard. But instead of going back to the kitchen, she came up to me and whispered that Harriet was dead. Perhaps she was hoping for discretion, but I'm afraid I lost control. It was the shock that made me cry out. I'm still not sure what I feel. Not grief, certainly not that. Dorothy stood at the door, immovable. She said that a detective was on her way. Vera. She's a Stanhope too. A kind of cousin or aunt, but her dad was a black sheep of the family, and we'd quite lost touch. I wonder what she'd make of us all now.
So, Juliet overheard a heated argument. Could that have anything to do with what happened this evening? Our last suspect is Crispin, husband to the victim, Harriet. Brockburn is his home. Let's begin questioning.
Well, everyone thinks I'm an old fool, but I wouldn't have kept this place going, supporting my tenant farmers and keeping the old traditions alive, if I didn't have a certain level of intelligence. Of course, things were very different when I was growing up. There were certain entitlements, but we knew that obligations came with those privileges. Hector, however, my father's youngest brother, never seemed to understand that. He was always chafing against the restrictions. In the end, the family said he could do his own thing and wanted nothing more to do with him. He had a daughter, though, Vera. I met her once before tonight, at Hector's funeral. She was a lump, sort of ungainly kind of creature. I'll admit, I was surprised to learn we were related. I know that I've never been a model husband or father, but I've always tried to remain discreet, to uphold my position in the community. It was the position, after all, that Harriet married. I think she would have accepted any proposal if it came with a grand country house and a status in the county. She was a beautiful, slender young thing when we met. I thought she'd do very well. Turned out, she was demanding, bossy even, and I didn't receive the warmth and the support that I had expected from marriage. Perhaps things would have been different if there'd been more children. I was never hung up on the notion of a son, but I was an only child myself, and I always wanted to fill these grounds with rowdy offspring. It would have been a paradise for children. Land to explore, trees to climb. Of course, I love the bones of Juliet, but you could never describe her as rowdy, and I don't think she'll be making me a grandfather anytime soon. She's a tender, sensitive type, but her and I are very close. I'd certainly never do anything to hurt her. That's why I tolerate her husband, Mark, and his disruptive notions. Perhaps I even agree with some of them. I can certainly see that something dramatic will have to happen at Brockburn for it to remain in the family. I couldn't bear to be remembered as the Stanhope who let this old dear go. Yes, Harriet and I did have a discussion earlier in the evening, but I certainly wouldn't call it a mega row. Juliet can be dramatic about these sorts of things. Harriet and I have had far worse altercations in our marriage. I think sometimes the arguing is all we had to keep the relationship alive. I can't even remember what it was about now. I think I was asking Harriet to be politer to our guests. After all, this is our final attempt to keep Brockburn in the family. I had hoped that this would mean as much to her as it did to me. I didn't raise my voice, but she did seem very eager for me to leave. I wonder now whether she was going to meet with someone else, perhaps someone who she met her untimely death with. Of course, it is all terribly sad. I should have been braver when I was younger. There was someone with whom I would have been happier, but I put my family and my status in front of my own need. After the chat with Harriet, I went and got changed and then went down to see the guests. They'd all made quite an effort, actually. They looked rather grand in a sort of vulgar, exhibitionist sort of way. Of course, I took my wife with me to the dining room. We both know the importance of putting on a show. Mark isn't the only theatrical member of this family. And we had a rather pleasant evening, I thought. I certainly can't think of a single incident that would have ended in the violent altercation that ended my wife's life. After the meal, I went to the drawing room and had some coffee. Harriet told me she was getting sick of the whole charade. I thought this was a little ungracious, but she'd been polite enough all evening. I thought she may as well go while things are running smoothly. I assumed she would go to her room. I certainly did not expect for her to be murdered. Yes, I left the drawing room several times. The old bladder isn't what it used to be. I certainly didn't see Harriet again after that. We'd grown used to each other. I was almost fond of the jousts and sparring. And I'm genuinely sorry that she is dead. It seems eerily fitting to me that this should happen on the darkest night of the year.
So the argument Crispin had with his wife maybe wasn't as heated as Juliet had suggested. There is a lot to think about here. We should spend some time looking over the evidence that Vera put together, take a short break, make a much needed cup of tea, or wine, not that we should be drinking on the job, and I'll see you in 10 minutes. The evidence you need will be on the screen during this time. Your time is up. We need an answer. We can't keep the suspects here much longer. Now, tell me, was it Dorothy, Harriet's housekeeper? Mark, Harriet's son-in-law? Juliet, Harriet's daughter? Or Crispin, Harriet's husband? Let's see who committed this dreadful crime. Show yourself, murderer. Rise from your seat. It is time to confess.
Yes, I killed my mother. It was a dreadful thing to do, but she provoked me to a violence which was completely out of character. Everyone thinks of me as a timid little thing, easily bullied. Tonight, I proved that I can only be pushed so far. I didn't stab her because she treated me so unkindly or because she despised me. I'd lived with that all my life. She was an arrogant woman, stubborn in her certainties. She couldn't even be happy for me when I found a man who loved me and whom I loved. But it was her treatment of Dorothy, my half-sister, that made me lose my temper and my reason. The killing wasn't planned. If Mother had been sympathetic, listened, truly listened to what I had to say, then we would have been able to come together as a family. I only found out about my real relationship with Dorothy a month ago. I was looking in Mark's desk for some insurance papers, and I found the letter. It was an old-fashioned photocopy. I assumed he'd left the original where he'd found it. Mark had come across it when he was a third-year undergraduate at university, and it had been written more than a decade before that. I assumed the woman had thought it would be safer to keep it at work than at home, where Dorothy might find it, and couldn't bring herself to destroy it. Why had Mark taken a copy when he'd come across it? Perhaps he thought it might be useful in his final dissertation if his final dissertation failed to impress. None of this shows Mark in a very good light, but I don't suppose that matters now. He wouldn't stick by a wife who was a convicted killer, so I'm sure he'll divorce me. The decision is quite out of my hands. When Mark had dug out the letter after all these years, he hadn't realised its full significance. To him, it was just leverage to persuade my father to support his plans for the house. But something about the small details rang a bell with me. It had been written by my father to a woman called Margaret, and it was clear she'd just told him that she was carrying his child. Mark's tutor at the university had been called Margaret, and that was the name of Dorothy's mother. I remembered those few occasions when Dorothy's mother had come into the house. Usually she just dropped the girl off, but sometimes I dragged her in and persuaded her to stay for tea or supper. How awkward that must have been for Margaret, and how kind of her not to dissuade us from our very close friendship. Tonight, my mother was insufferable. She'd been sniping at Dorothy all day, and I could see how tired Dorothy was and how much effort she'd put into making the evening a success. She had no idea that we were related, that she might actually have a stake in the place. She just wanted to help. I went to Mother's room earlier in the evening to have the matter out with her, and despite what I told you earlier, I found her alone. I told her about the letter I'd found in Mark's desk. Dorothy is my father's daughter. She probably has a claim on the estate. You can't treat her as if she were a servant. I never talked to Mother like that, and she was shocked, but not completely surprised by the news. Perhaps she'd guessed about the relationship all along, and had treated my friend so dreadfully in the hope that she'd leave. Dorothy's presence in the place must have been a constant reminder of her husband's infidelities. My mother was unmoved, characteristically arrogant. Even if what you say is true, there's no proof. Do you really believe Crispin would agree to a DNA test? And then she dismissed me and said if the evening's performance was to go ahead with any style, she'd need to prepare herself. After dinner, my mother came into the kitchen to demand herbal tea, to show again who was boss. Dorothy was in the dining room, clearing the table, and I was there to escape the crowd for a moment. "The woman knows I can't take coffee in the evening," Harriet said, her voice a whine of complaint. "How thoughtless she is." And that was all it took for me to kill her. There was a chef's knife on the table. Dorothy had used it to prepare our delicious dinner, and it was very, very sharp. I stuck it into my mother's chest, and I pulled her body out of the door and into the snow. It took a matter of minutes. Then I ran up the stairs and into my room before Dorothy returned. I had to wash the blood from my hands. Of course, there was no shadowy figure running around the house, no footsteps hidden by a sudden blizzard. I made those up. After all, this is a traditional country house murder, and red herrings are important. I was telling the truth, though, when I said I felt no grief at my mother's death.
So it was you, Juliet. Did you see this coming, detectives? Was it there all along, hidden in plain sight? Well done, detectives. You did pretty good for your first night on the job. Between you and me, we could use more bright sparks like you on the team. I'll be putting in a good word for you, that's for sure. It might be we could use your help again in the future. I can't thank you enough for your support with this case. Vera and I couldn't have done it without your help. We should probably call this in at the station. I'm sure the whole village will be devastated by this news. Be honest though, how many of you actually managed to guess that Juliet was our killer? And if you did guess correctly, what evidence was it that led you to your conclusion? Until we meet again, detectives, take care and stay safe. Tonight wouldn't have been possible without some great people putting in the work behind the scenes. I want to say a big thank you to Ann Cleeves for writing such an engaging script, inspired by her book, The Darkest Evening. It is available to order through your local library if you want to give it a read. Thank you to Macmillan too for the permission to use the story in the first place. Thank you also to Libraries Unlimited, the charity who runs Devon Libraries and lets us put on these wonderful events. You can make a donation to library services by following the link in the video description. A donation, however small, helps us to run life-changing library services across Devon. And finally, I must thank the staff at Newton Abbot Library for their hard work in putting this all together. This finished product is hours of dressing up, makeup, filming and editing, so we hope you had as good a time watching this as we had making it. We had a lot of fun putting it together and would love to know what you thought. I'll leave you now with a few bloopers from our filming experience. Enjoy!